Released after a life sentence, an elderly woman walks straight from prison to her husband's grave, only to find a second headstone right beside it. Her daughter's name, dates that don't make sense, and behind a nearby tree, a little girl is watching her. This grandmother has just discovered that everyone she loved is gone, but the child hiding in the shadows holds a secret that could prove she never should have been locked up in the first place. 32 years of lies. A daughter who died trying to expose the truth, and a powerful man who will do anything to keep his crimes buried. What really happened the night that sent an innocent woman to prison? Why did her daughter die on a road she had no reason to be on? And what does this frightened little girl know that someone is desperate to keep hidden? The gates opened at 7:14 inches the morning. Doris Marsh had counted 32 years, 4 months, and 11 days inside those walls. She had entered at 31 years old, her hair the color of dark honey, her hands still soft from the lotion she used to rub into them every night before bed. She walked out at 63, her hair silver white, her hands rough and cracked from decades of prison laundry detail. They gave her $47, a bus ticket to the nearest town, and a plastic bag containing the clothes she'd worn the day she arrived. The dress didn't fit anymore. Nothing from that life fit anymore. So she walked out in the same gray sweatpants and faded blue t-shirt she'd been wearing for the past 3 years, the closest thing to civilian clothes the prison commissary offered. The morning air hit her face, and Doris stopped walking. She just stood there, 3 feet past the gate, breathing. The air smelled different out here. Not the recycled staleness of institutional ventilation, not the harsh chemical bite of industrial cleaner. This air smelled like wet grass and car exhaust, and somewhere, impossibly far away, someone was frying bacon. Doris closed her eyes and let the smell wash over her. Bacon. She hadn't smelled bacon in 32 years. A corrections officer called out from behind her. "Ma'am, you need to keep moving. You can't stand there." Doris opened her eyes. The sky was gray, threatening rain, and the wind carried a chill that cut through her thin clothes. She started walking toward the bus stop, her legs stiff and uncertain, like a newborn deer trying to find its footing. The bus station was 1.5 miles from the prison. Doris walked the whole way, even though her knees ached and her left hip had never been the same since she'd fallen in the shower 6 years ago. She walked because she could, because for 32 years, the farthest she'd been allowed to walk was from her cell to the cafeteria, from the cafeteria to the yard, from the yard back to her cell. Now there were no walls, no fences, no guards counting her steps. She could walk to the end of the earth if she wanted to. But Doris didn't want to walk to the end of the earth. She wanted to walk to Ridgewood Cemetery in the town of Clearfield, Ohio. She wanted to find her husband's grave and tell him she was sorry she'd made him wait so long. Howard Marsh had been the kind of man who kept his promises. When he'd married Doris in the summer of 1987, he'd promised to love her until the day he died. When their daughter Christine was born 2 years later, he'd promised to be the father his own father had never been. And when Doris was arrested in 1992, charged with a crime she swore she didn't commit, Howard had promised to wait. "I'll be here," he'd told her through the glass partition during their first visit. His eyes were red-rimmed, his hands pressed flat against the barrier between them. "However long it takes, I'll be here when you get out." Doris had believed him. Even when the appeals failed, even when the years stretched into decades, even when Howard's visits became monthly, then quarterly, then once a year at Christmas. She'd believed him because Howard Marsh was the kind of man who kept his promises. The letters had stopped 12 years ago. At first, Doris had told herself he was sick. Then she'd told herself the mail was being lost. Then she'd told herself he'd moved and hadn't been able to send his new address. She'd written to him at their old house, the Little Blue Cape Cod on Maple Street, where they'd brought Christine home from the hospital, where they'd planted tomatoes in the backyard every spring, where they'd slow danced in the kitchen to songs on the radio while their daughter slept upstairs. The letters came back, returned to sender. No forwarding address. She'd tried calling, but the number was disconnected. She'd asked her court-appointed attorney to look into it, but he'd retired years ago, and his replacement didn't return her messages. She'd written to the Clearfield Public Library, asking if anyone could help her find information about Howard Marsh, but she'd never received a response. So Doris had done the only thing she could do. She'd waited. She'd served her time. She'd kept her head down and her mouth shut and her hands busy with other people's dirty laundry. And she'd held on to the belief that somewhere out there, Howard was waiting for her too. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the cell block was silent except for the sounds of other women crying or praying or talking to themselves, Doris had allowed herself to consider the alternative. Maybe Howard wasn't waiting anymore. Maybe Howard couldn't wait anymore. Maybe Howard was dead. The bus dropped her in downtown Clearfield at 11:43 inches the morning. The town looked different, smaller, somehow, and older. The hardware store where Howard used to buy his tools had been replaced by a vape shop. The diner where they'd had their first date was now a payday loan office. The movie theater where he'd taken her to see Pretty Woman the year before everything fell apart was boarded up, its marquee blank and rusted. Doris stood on the sidewalk, clutching her plastic bag of useless old clothes, and tried to remember which direction the cemetery was. "You lost, honey?" She turned. An elderly black woman was watching her from the doorway of a small grocery store, arms crossed, expression more curious than concerned. "I'm looking for Ridgewood Cemetery," Doris said. Her voice came out rough and scratchy. She'd barely spoken in years. There hadn't been much point. The woman's eyebrows rose. "That's a long walk from here. 3 miles, maybe more. You got someone coming to pick you up?" Doris shook her head. The woman studied her for a long moment. Doris knew what she saw: the institutional clothes, the plastic bag, the particular kind of pallor that came from decades without real sunlight. There was no hiding where she'd come from, but the woman didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't suddenly remember somewhere else she needed to be. "Wait here," she said, and disappeared into the store. She came back a few minutes later with a brown paper bag and a bottle of water. "There's a sandwich in there, turkey and cheese, and an apple. You eat something before you start walking. Hear me?" Doris stared at the bag. "I don't have money to." "Did I ask for money?" The woman pressed the bag into Doris's hands. "Cemetery's that way. Follow Main Street until it turns into Route 9, then take the first right after the gas station. You'll see the gates." "Thank you," Doris managed. "Thank you. You don't need to thank me." The woman's voice softened. "We all need a little kindness sometimes, even when we don't think we deserve it." She went back into her store, and Doris was alone again on the sidewalk, holding a paper bag that felt heavier than it should have, like it contained more than just a sandwich and an apple, like it contained proof that the world hadn't completely forgotten how to be gentle. Doris started walking. The rain began when she was halfway there. It started as a drizzle, light enough to ignore, but within minutes it had turned into a steady downpour that soaked through her thin clothes and plastered her silver hair to her skull. Doris kept walking. She'd survived worse than rain. She'd survived strip searches and solitary confinement, and the day her mother died, and she wasn't allowed to attend the funeral. She'd survived the morning they'd told her that her appeals were exhausted, that she would die in prison, that there was no more hope left. Rain was nothing. Rain was just water. The cemetery gates appeared through the gray curtain of weather, black iron twisted into shapes that might have been elegant once, but now just looked tired. Doris pushed through them and stepped onto the gravel path that wound between the headstones. She didn't know where Howard was buried. She'd imagined this moment so many times, walking through the cemetery, finding his grave, kneeling in the grass and telling him everything she'd never been able to say through prison glass and monitored phone calls. But she'd never imagined doing it blind, wandering between strangers' graves in the pouring rain, searching for a name she'd carried in her heart for 32 years. The cemetery was larger than she remembered. Rows and rows of headstones stretched out in every direction, some tall and ornate, others simple and small. Doris walked slowly, reading names as she went. Patterson, Wheeler, Dominguez, Morrison, no Marsh. She walked for what felt like hours. The rain didn't let up. Her shoes squelched with every step, and her fingers had gone numb with cold. But she kept going, kept searching, kept believing that if she just looked hard enough, she would find him. And then she did. The headstone was modest, gray granite, about 2 feet tall, with a simple curved top. The letters were carved deep into the stone, filled with something dark that made them stand out even in the rain. Howard James Marsh, beloved husband and father, the 3rd of March 1958, October 17, 2019. He kept his promises. Doris's knees gave out. She hit the wet ground hard, but she didn't feel it. She didn't feel anything except the words carved into that stone, burning themselves into her brain. The 17th of October 2019, 5 years ago. Howard had died 5 years ago, and no one had told her. No one had thought she deserved to know. She'd spent 5 years writing letters to a dead man, believing he was alive, believing he was waiting, believing that when she finally got out, he would be there. But Howard was here, in the ground, under a stone that said he kept his promises. "I'm sorry," Doris whispered, pressing her palms into the wet earth in front of the grave. "I'm sorry I made you wait so long. I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry, Howard. I'm so sorry." The rain fell. The wind blew. Doris knelt in the mud and cried for the first time in 32 years. She didn't know how long she stayed there. Long enough for the rain to soak through to her skin, long enough for her tears to run dry, and her voice to go hoarse from apologizing to a man who couldn't hear her anymore. When she finally lifted her head, her vision blurred with rain and exhaustion. She saw it, another headstone, right next to Howard's. Same gray granite, same simple design, same dark lettering, but a different name. Doris blinked hard, trying to clear her eyes, trying to make sense of what she was seeing, because it couldn't be real. It couldn't be what it looked like. There had to be some mistake, some cruel trick of the light and the rain and her own grief-addled mind. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, the mud cold and thick beneath her palms. She got close enough to read the words, close enough to be sure. Christine Mary Marsh, beloved daughter and mother, the 12th of September 1989, June 3, 2021, forever in our hearts. Christine. Her daughter Christine, the baby she'd held in her arms for 3 years before the world ripped her away. The little girl she'd left behind, believing, trusting that Howard would raise her, protect her, keep her safe until Doris could come home. The child she'd written to every single week for 32 years, even when the letters stopped being answered, even when the hope died. Christine was dead. Christine was dead, and she'd been dead for 3 years. And Doris hadn't known, hadn't been told, hadn't been given the chance to say goodbye, to hold her hand, to tell her that she loved her, that she'd always loved her, that every day in that prison she'd thought about her